So I've been wanting to make this video for a very long time because at heart I'm a PC gamer. I've spent a lot of time on console at this point, but there was a time where I considered myself to be a PC gamer first and foremost. I mean, I still play games on PC through Xbox, but it's kind of hard these days to imagine a time where PC collecting was even relevant. I was actually one of those people who really didn't want physical media to disappear when Steam came along around 2003. So that's why part of my affinity for games for Windows Live came from the connection between achievements and one of my favorite consoles, the Xbox 360. That achievement system was actually one of the many reasons I eventually started collecting games on Xbox in the first place. So in other words, my interest in achievements led me to Xbox collecting, and eventually that same interest brought me back to physical PC games, and that's really what made me want to talk about my Games for Windows Live collection today. But before we get into the games, let's talk about kind of the difference between games for Windows and games for Windows Live. So Crysis came out in 2007, right around the time where Microsoft was really trying to push games for Windows as a standard for PC gaming. But games for Windows didn't automatically mean Xbox achievements. As you can see from the case here, it doesn't say live, it only says games for Windows. So that's why if we take a look at Halo 2, because this is where Microsoft really started bringing the Xbox Live experience over to PC. So this now included gamer tags, online features, and most importantly for me at least, achievements and gamer score. And if we look at the two side by side, the Games for Windows catalog eventually grew to around 250 released titles, while the Games for Windows Live catalog contains only 73 titles. And as it turns out, I have a little over half of that Games for Windows Live catalog, with 37 of those currently in my physical game collection. And with this first game, it feels sort of appropriate to start with this one, especially now that James Bond has finally made a comeback in video games with 007 First Light earlier this year. So 007 Quantum of Solace was released in 2008 with Treyarch developing the Xbox 360 version and Beenox handled the PC version. Now you may know both of these devs from various projects, but Beenox is now also kind of incorporated into making Call of Duty stuff. They primarily made Spider-Man games for Activision. And as we know, Treyarch was primarily known for Call of Duty Black Ops. And the game itself was based on both the Casino Royale movie and Quantum of Solace the movie, both starring Daniel Craig, of course. And it also happened to be the first James Bond game published by Activision after they had acquired the rights to make and publish James Bond games. But what's really interesting from a collecting perspective at least is that there were actually 4 James Bond games released on Xbox 360 during this generation. But Quantum of Solace, oddly enough, is the only one of those 4 that ended up on Games for Windows Live. And since this game released on both 360 and Games for Windows Live, it did in fact have 2 separate achievement lists. So you could double dip on this game and you can get a total of 2,000 gamer score if you wanted. Just keep in mind, obviously, if you do play this game, it did have some multiplayer stuff, so you're gonna have to get through that if you want obviously the full 1,000 gamer score. So if you had played obviously Call of Duty in the past, also published by Activision of course, Treyarch actually used like a heavily modified engine or version of Infinity Ward's engine, which helped kind of give the game a little bit of a Call of Duty vibe, or at least Modern Warfare. So even though this is a James Bond game based on the movies that I mentioned, there's just a little bit of Call of Duty hiding underneath it as well. And then we get to Batman Arkham Asylum, one of my personal favorites on this list, and this is really where things got more interesting for me, at least from a game collecting perspective and also as an achievement hunter. So when the Xbox 360 version first came out in August of 2009, it also had a PC version the following month, also known as the Games for Windows Live version in this case. And if you played Arkham Asylum, you know that this was a relatively straightforward 1,000 gamer score, but I think this is one of those games that did achievements right, because even though you had hard difficulty and collectibles and also challenge mode, it never felt like it overstayed its welcome, because probably overall it would be like a 15 to 20 hour game your first time around, and obviously subsequent playthroughs and stacks it would take you a little less time, but it still didn't make it any less fun in my opinion. Like, this was one of those games that was a good entry level for quote unquote stacking in some ways. But what I didn't know at the time is that this game would get a Game of the Year edition, and I remember thinking thinking that this was probably just like a re-release that had nothing else going for it other than maybe a little extra content and maybe some DLC that wasn't previously released on disc. But it turns out the Game of the Year edition actually got its own achievement list, and this was completely foreign to me at the time, but it is also something that started that game collecting journey for me, and also playing the game again, making it feel fresh by getting a new set of achievements for it too. And the best news about this too was that the Games of Windows Live versions also got the same exact releases, so you could get up to 4,000 gamer score just across those two releases. And that's not even mentioning the separate Japanese release that also came out on the Xbox 360. So not only did I get to play this fantastic game so many times, but getting all these physical collectibles too is really awesome to look back at now. And then of course, we have more Batman here. We also have Batman Arkham City. And this game came out in 2011 with the PC version arriving about a month after the Xbox 360 release. And again, this was another game by Rocksteady, so you could expect more of the same, but a lot of people will probably agree that this was a big improvement on the first game even. As much as I love Arkham Asylum, this one had better combat, better stealth, more of an open world rather than that Metroidvania style that the first game had. And similar to Arkham Asylum, this game obviously got a Games of Windows Live release as well with achievements, but it was slightly different than that because you could still buy the standard edition of Arkham City and you can still get the 50 achievements worth 1,000 gamer score in the base game with that standard edition, but it was missing the DLC unless you bought the Game of the Year edition. And the Game of the Year edition included the same DLC that the Xbox 360 had for the Game of the Year edition, which was Harley Quinn's DLC, and you also had the extra challenge maps for Robin and Nightwing. But the main difference here was that you didn't actually get the 500 gamer score that you did on the Xbox 360. You only got 350 for whatever reason. And as far as I've checked, I don't know if anything was really missing from this version, but they just decided to give you less gamer score. And you'll see that in a couple of other entries too, that there was some discrepancies in the score, but again, the most important thing is that you actually had the DLC on the disc here. But if you were like me and you wanted to play this game as many times as possible because it is an incredible game, then you got to do probably the challenge maps up to like 600 times total or whatever it is, 600 medals, and that's a lot of Arkham City. And moving on from the Arkham games, we have another game and series that I have played the heck out of. Like, I don't know how many times I played this particular one, but BioShock 2 is one of those entries where it starts getting a little bit strange as well. Not necessarily for the standard one, but you'll see that with the other edition I have here that is a little bit harder to come by. So the standard PC version came out early 2010, so it was actually the same day as the Xbox 360 version, and both of them had the same amount of achievements as well. But the Games of Windows Live version is slightly different from Xbox 360 in terms of gamer score, with the PC version getting 20 gamer score less for one achievement. That was, I believe, on the 360 worth 50, but instead it was 30 on Games of Windows Live. A little bit of a weird discrepancy, but everything else is the same with the DLC and the base game. But obviously this was another game that had DLC, so if you didn't get that DLC from the Games of Windows Marketplace, it became increasingly more difficult to get it after that was shut down because there was no Game of the Year edition for this game. But on Xbox 360, both BioShock 1 and BioShock 2 was included as kind of like a collection, and that one has all the DLC on the disc. But there is another edition that is very unusual, and I've been wanting to talk about this one for many years, and that is actually a Russian version of BioShock 2 on PC. So this was obviously a completely separate Russian PC release, and this was completely localized by a company called 1C and released in Russia in June of 2010. So it was still the same year, but they needed a couple extra months, I guess, to fully localize this game. And when I say localized, I mean it's the entire thing. It's the most fascinating version of a game I played because you can go through the whole game and pick up audio diaries and obviously the conversations that are going on. I almost felt like I was in like a Russian podcast. It was the most interesting thing because the gameplay is the same, but you feel like you are in a completely different world because it's not in English, and it's a very interesting game. So only thing I can say, if you ever get your hands on a copy of this game in Russian, it's incredibly fascinating, and I definitely recommend going through it if you've played this game a lot and you know it in and out. But then this just throws you a curveball and suddenly it's completely different experience. And this version of the game has also been a little bit more sought after as well and more difficult to find. I had to get it as part of like a special edition or kind of a collector's edition that came with an art book and also a keychain. But you could also get in kind of like a smaller jewel case form as well. So there are obviously ways to get this game, but it is a very intriguing way to play this game. But underneath all of that, of course, it's the same BioShock 2 experience. It's the same multiplayer experience that you would have with the other versions as well. And contrary to the other editions, this one only had the base 1000, so whatever you had to do for multiplayer in this one was just kind of like the base stuff you had to do, so you didn't have to worry about any DLC at all. But, you know, this is probably one of the coolest collectibles I have in my collection, and I find myself looking at this one from time to time and thinking like, this is one of the weirdest experiences I've had in games. And then we have a game called BlazBlue Calamity Trigger. This one's already a little bit unusual because it's first and foremost a fighting game, which isn't necessarily the first genre you associate with Games From Us Live. Although I have actually played some fighting games on PC, of course, and there are gonna be a few others here as well. And this game was developed by Arc System Works, who I believe had made most, if not all, of the BlazBlue games, and it released in 2009. The interesting part about this game, as you'll see in a couple of instances in my list here, or in my collection, is that this was one of those cross-play titles. So Windows and Xbox 360 players could actually play against each other, which is still, to me, a really cool concept that early on, because we could see later on Xbox really pushed for that cross-play, and when other companies like Nintendo and Sony, they didn't really want to do the cross-play stuff, but eventually, as we know it today, you know, cross-play exists, and that is pretty cool that they experimented with it here. And that's, you know, around 2009, 2010, it was kind of a big deal. But sadly though, you know, this game had to share the same achievement list with the Xbox 360 version. So there was no separate stack for this game, but, you know, still, it's a really cool idea. And I'm always glad to hear when they tried stuff like this. I'm not 100% sure how well it actually worked, especially with fighting games and stuff like that. There could be obviously some latency issues and some connection issues, of course. So, but, you know, just kudos to them for trying at the time. And, you know, this seemed like it would be the type of game that would be a good test of that. But back then, this was the kind of thing that was new and exciting. And then next up, we have Bulletstorm, and every time I talk about Bulletstorm, people get very excited, and I can understand why. This was developed by People Can Fly, and closely working with Epic Games and published by EA, and it came out in 2011 as what a lot of people would consider one of the more outrageous shooters of that generation, and I totally agree, it is a pretty outrageous first-person shooter. But there's a little bit of an interesting connection here, because if you know anything about People Can Fly, obviously they've gone on to make a lot more games after Bulletstorm, but they also had a hand in making Gears of War Judgment. They're also known for the Painkiller games, and they've also worked closely with Epic throughout the year. So this was kind of like a collaboration between all parties, and you kind of got a very creative new IP, which, you know, you can argue that you don't really see games like this anymore. There's no risk, and people don't really make games like this anymore, and that's probably why it's still such a good memory for people, and people keep revisiting this game as one of the most unique shooters at the time, because this game was centered around skill shots. That was the whole idea with this game. And if you try to play this as a regular first-person shooter, which I did to begin with, I found it very boring. But once you kind of unlock more skills and you find out about the different weapons and the different skill shots, this game is so much fun. But it did have a separate achievement list from the Xbox 360, and it did also have DLC. Now, you can probably imagine that this one didn't exactly get Game of the Year all around, so it didn't have a separate physical release for the DLC. So if you didn't grab that, obviously, before the store shut down, then there was no other way to get that DLC at the time. And looking back at a game like this is easily one of the most memorable games I played on Games From Us Live and on Xbox 360, without a doubt. And then we get to a game called The Club, and I've seen this game on a lot of people's underrated hidden gems lists, and that might be the case, but I would say that this is also kind of a strange game too, because of who made this game first and foremost, I think. Because if you know Bizarre Creations, they are mostly known for racing games like Project Gotham Racing. I was naturally very curious of what this would be like, and this is going to be like a third-person shooter, but it feels like kind of like a racing game, and that's sort of what this game is. It kind of has both of those genres colliding a little bit into making a pretty unique game. But the basic premise of this game is that you're running through levels, killing enemies as quickly as you possibly can, and while you're trying to keep your multiplier alive. And this one also had 2 separate achievement lists for Games of Windows Live and Xbox 360, but unfortunately the Games of Windows Live version launched with one unobtainable achievement that never seemingly had been fixed. So if you play this one on PC, then you cannot get the 100% completion on that one. On the 360, it's absolutely untouched. Everything is working as it should there. So for a game that came out in 2008, you know, this was a pretty interesting one. And yet again, another game that took a risk of making something different. And since I'm doing this in alphabetical order, we have now arrived at Dark Souls. And this is probably what I would consider somewhat of a grail in terms of at least Games for Windows Live releases. And I'll explain why, because it is a little bit of a weird one. The Xbox 360 version released in 2011, and then you had this PC version following year in August of 2012. So it came out a little bit later. And the original PC release is this Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition, and it did use Games for Windows Live. I do believe this came as a big collector's edition, or like what they would refer to, of course, as the Prepare to Die edition. It didn't just have the game in there, but it had some extra goodies too, and possibly some collectibles and maybe even a statue in there. But the one that I have was just the game. So I bought this one many years ago, and I think I paid way less than what it goes for these days, especially if you get this game new. And this particular edition didn't just include a straight up port, it also had the DLC, or at least the DLC expansion from the 360, new areas, new enemies, bosses, and otherwise what came out as DLC for the 360. And once the Games for Windows Marketplace shut down, more and more games started migrating away from Games for Windows, where Steam was kind of patching Games for Windows out of the different editions of it. And this was one of those games that had a lot of problems launching again through Games for Windows Live. There had to be several workarounds, and you had to utilize Steam to get it working again. So this particular copy is somewhat of a rarity, I would say, you know, and I've seen over the years how the price has gone up on this one, especially for new copies, since I do own a new copy of this game and I have not activated it yet. So it's one of those situations where once I open this game and I activate it, it loses all its value, but at least I get to play it and I can activate the game online. But if I keep it sealed and I don't use it, then suddenly it's become a very valuable collectible that I could even sell someday. So as long as Games for Windows Live and as long as Xbox 360 service works, then people should still be able to play this game. But obviously there are still some things you have to do on your PC to get it working properly. But I mean, the good news about this, it does have 2 separate achievement lists. So if I decided to play something like this on Games for Windows Live, then it would be a fresh list, just like it is on the Xbox 360. So having played this a little bit on the 360 as well, I'm actually really interested in trying this out on Games for Windows Live as well. And then we move on to Dead Rising 2, which also happened to be the very first Dead Rising game that I played. And this released on Xbox 360 in 2010, and the PC version followed shortly after that. So this wasn't developed by Capcom, this was by Blue Castle Games, which I think is out of Canada. So it was around the time where Capcom was trying out different third-party companies, or at least developers that were not stationed in Japan. So it was a little bit of an interesting shift for Capcom. Contrary to Capcom these days, they weren't doing as well back in the 2010s, I would say. It really wasn't until Resident Evil 7 came out that they really started going uphill again, but I'm glad that they were able to turn things around and not just throw stuff at the wall and hopefully something would stick. But for being my first game in that series, you know, I thought it was a good place to start as well. And in this game, rather than playing as Frank West, you now played as Chuck Green, and you can't deny that the most fun thing about Dead Rising is really the combo weapon crafting. At least in my opinion, that's kind of what I look forward to in all the Dead Rising games, just to go through all the stores and wear the different outfits and be silly and get all these crazy weapons. I mean, that's kind of the main reason I like playing the Dead Rising games, at least. And throw in some co-op in there too, then that is a great time. And this also had a separate achievement list from the Xbox 360, same one though. And if you have played Dead Rising in the past, you know that they tend to like just doing straight up every achievement is 20 gamer score and you get 50 achievements and that equals 1,000 gamer score. So they didn't really differentiate on how difficult one achievement was or anything like that. But it of course has that notorious 50,000 plus zombie kills, which you have to do on one save. And so, you know, can be a little bit exhausting to get through all of that, you know, but that's kind of the life of an achievement hunter, I guess. You go through the most miserable experiences just to get that 100% completion. So this is no different. This was unfortunately one of those games that was like a one-time code, so you had to get like a new copy of this game and you could only activate it on your account, which we were starting to see, you know, early 2010s and throughout the end of the marketplace, at least for this. There was a lot more DRM, there's a lot more secure stuff that happened. So there are obviously some workarounds you could do these days, but typically you would need to be online to activate the game, and it would just kind of give you a signal back that you had activated the game, and then you could go play it, of course. So the times were changing and that's what you had to kind of deal with. But this was a great one to play again on PC through Games for Windows Live. And why don't we stay with Dead Rising? Because, you know, there was another spin-off of this, and that was Dead Rising 2 Off the Record. So this one is particularly interesting, and not just this one, because if you are familiar with Dead Rising 2, there were multiple other spin-offs as well, and multiple other variations and releases in different countries on PC and backwards compatible and the whole thing. So they really maximized the profits on Dead Rising 2. But in this one, they didn't just make a sequel, they just took Dead Rising 2 and they changed the protagonist. So instead of Chuck Green, you're now playing as Frank West from the first Dead Rising game. It's a whole new reimagining, in a sense, of Fortune City, and it's got different stories, new missions, new areas, and of course now you had Frank West's camera where you could start gaining the prestige points through the camera, or PP. I don't know why it's always funny, the PP points or whatever, but that's how it always is. But you earn PP, and that's what Dead Rising does, I guess. And this game was exactly the same as Dead Rising 2. You just had to buy a new copy and activate your one-time code, and then you were able to activate and play the game. And it did have a separate achievement stack for Games with Windows Live and Xbox 360, exactly the same, 50 achievements, 1,000 gamer score. But if you were so excited to play Dead Rising 2, this was another opportunity to do so, because you got to play as Frank West. And I know Frank West is most people's favorite, but another reason to revisit these games. And then we have Fable 3, another game that's kind of fitting to talk about right now with the next Fable coming out pretty soon. And I don't know about you, but I like the Fable games and I'm pretty excited about that one. But it's not going to be by Lionhead this time. Fable 3 is the last really official Fable game that came out, and then Lionhead Studios shut down. But at least for the Xbox 360 version of Fable 3 that came out in 2010, and then we got the PC version in 2011, so the next year. And I just realized that this might be the first exclusive that we've talked about today. So yeah, Fable 3 obviously was a Microsoft published game. Going back all the way to OG Xbox, it was one of the most popular games on OG Xbox, the very first Fable game. But with Fable 3, it was probably the least successful Fable, and they tried a bunch of different things in this game. And you know, I have to be honest, like I actually really liked Fable 3. I didn't have as many issues with it, and I enjoyed it in co-op, which is exactly, you know, what they were trying to push with Games of Windows Live as well. Other than this game having the exact same achievement list, including the DLC, they were two separate achievement stacks. So you could play this obviously on the 360, and then you can play it again on Games of Windows Live. And just like Dark Souls, Fable 3 has kind of become one of those sought after games as well on Games of Windows Live, because it is that one-time code and you have to get a new copy or you have to get an unused license. So this is just another great example of what made Games of Windows Live interesting to me, because you had the same functionality as the Xbox 360, but they encouraged people to play co-op over Xbox Live through PC. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then we're finally at Fallout 3, and there's quite a story with this one. And this was probably everyone's first Fallout game, I would assume, unless you played the old PC games or the Fallout games that came out on OG Xbox. But this was my first Fallout game, and this is obviously developed and published by Bethesda themselves. And the 360 and PC versions came out on the same day in October of 2008. So we're getting up there almost 20 years for Fallout 3. We're which is crazy. But I did play this on the 360 first, way before I even knew there was a Games with Windows Live type of thing with this one. So I got all the achievements and I thoroughly enjoyed this game. Fantastic open world post-apocalyptic game, of course, and I'm sure most people have played one variation of Fallout in their life. But you know, I have actually come across people who haven't played Fallout or they don't like Fallout, and that's absolutely fine, of course. And the funny thing about the Games with Windows Live version is kind of how most people would start with that platform was really with Fallout 3, because it's kind of gotten a little bit infamous over the years for having one of the biggest achievement shortcuts really in that whole library. I don't know if there are more games you could do this with, but this is one that you could actually run console commands and it didn't disable the achievements, so you literally could type in to get into the whole developer console or whatever you could put in the commands, and you could just type add achievement 1, add achievement 2, and it was like the funniest thing. But you know, I think most achievement hunters have done this on one gamer tag or another. That's just kind of how it goes. And you know, later on we saw a little bit more of that in Xbox One Series X2 on Windows, that you were able to use console commands on some games. And so that's typically, you know, what was considered one of the early easy achievement completions. And you know, I think it's one of those things that it makes it famous and infamous or whatever you want to call it. But that's kind of the whole Fallout 3 experience on Games with Windows Live. But luckily, you know, I still had another version to play on the 360. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the remaster of this game. So, and one thing to note too, if you were to do the console command thing, you don't actually need to get the Game of the Year edition with the DLC. Everything should still unlock with the DLC. So I'm still looking to add that to my collection, but it just, because of all of this, I just haven't dished out the money yet to add it to the Games with Windows Live collection yet. And then we have a game that I don't have a lot of experience with, but you know, I just had to pick this up, of course, because it's one of the few racing, or at least arcade racing style games I have on Games with Windows Live, and that is Flat Out Ultimate Carnage. And this is a game from 2007 by Bugbear Entertainment, who have made lots of these racing or arcade style racing games. You know, the whole goal in this game is just destruction, right? So then that is kind of the name of the game. You know, you drive and you smash into cars, and you're just you're trying to take out your opponents as you're racing through the tracks, you know, in the most vicious way, or like you're just trying to destroy them basically. So you know, it's a fun arcade racer that I just, again, been looking forward to playing more of this one. I loaded this up and just tried to play the first kind of tutorial section, and you know, I did enjoy what I was playing. It kind of reminded me a little bit of it's like a stunt driver game, right? You know, just trying to get around the tracks and cause havoc and destroy things. So yeah, I really enjoyed what I played of this one, but that's pretty much all I know. And you know, you can play this twice, you know, because the achievement list is the same, but it is a stack on Games with Windows Live. So you know, for those reasons, I feel like I had to add this to the collections because I have it on both now. And then we finally arrived at another Xbox exclusive, of course, or at least at the time, flagship series. Of course, we have Gears of War, and the Xbox 360 version released in 2006, so, you know, a year after the 360 launched, and then the PC version came out a year after that again in 2007. And this is kind of like one of the clearest examples, really, of why I don't just look at this as the Xbox version on PC, because this had so much more going for it, and even the achievements were a little bit different too, or at least in how you were unlocking them. So essentially the Games with Windows Live version added quite a bit of content to it. So it had 5 additional campaign chapters that weren't part of the original 360 game, alongside multiple maps as well that wasn't part of the 360. And what's interesting about this too is that when they remastered this for Gears of War Ultimate, they actually included the missing chapters in that remaster in a sense. So essentially what you're seeing on Xbox One is the Gears of War Games with Windows Live version, but it looks like Gears of War 4 because they upped the graphics, of course, and made it look like more like Gears of War 4. So it just goes to show that they were very aware of what they had there, and they wanted to incorporate this into the Xbox One version as well. And you know, another one where the graphical upgrades here too, as good as Gears looked on the 360 back in the day, you know, when you play it on PC, you know, it looks 100 times better, and it plays so much better too. So you can almost put this side by by side with playing something like this through backwards compatibility on a Series X. You know, like that's how smooth it runs, and yeah, it's really fun to play this again. But as we know with Gears, it doesn't go without its struggles with achievements and the suffering that you have to go through to get all the achievements here. But contrary though to the 360 version that had the 1000 gamer score plus the 250 for the DLC, but the Games for Windows Live version only had 50 achievements for 1000G, so there's no DLC. So they've tried to like incorporate stuff into the 1000G, so there's actually no DLC as part of this one outside of the full 1000. And you could of course play this in co-op over Xbox Live, similar to Fable 3 of course, you know, and a lot of people did so. I'd be curious to see if I jumped into a Gears game on PC right now, if people are actually playing this game other than achievement hunters or whoever else. But I think it's pretty cool, and this is a piece of Xbox history really that I'm so happy to have as part of my collection, and you know, just another reason to play more Gears of War. And then we have another fitting game, because, you know, the next entry of this series is also about to come out this year. And that's Grand Theft Auto 4. And of course, this is by Rockstar and published by Rockstar. And the Xbox 360 version came out in April of 2008, before the Games for Windows Live version or the PC version came out in December of that same year. But the original PC release was very much part of that Games for Windows Live era. You know, this was a couple of years into its inception. So yeah, it was very much an early title for Games for Windows Live. But later on, it became a little bit more complicated to play this game. You know, when I installed it on the new computer, and I had a brand new copy with the DLC, like the whole complete edition. So it's one of those where I do believe it is like a legacy key, but because of all the measures that Rockstar put in place, they made it very difficult to activate the game. So you had to go through their launcher, you had to sign up for their account or their Rockstar social club or whatever it's called. And so yeah, they made things a lot more difficult later on, but that also had to do with the fact that they patched out like Games for Windows Live through Steam and stuff like that too. So it got very complicated post like 2014 to try to activate these games, because if you were playing these games at the time, you may have had some hiccups here and there and some connection issues, but activating the game usually wasn't an issue until later on. But like I said though, you know, you still will need to get the complete edition for this, with The Lost and the Damned and The Ballad of Gay Tony, which are two great DLCs of course. And then it is a separate stack for Games for Windows Live, so you still have the 1500 gamer score there, and then you get the 1500 on Xbox 360 as well. So it's a unique game to set up. Like, it took a little bit to get it going, and oddly enough, like the DLC sort of installs by itself, and it almost acts like it's a separate game. So that's also interesting, but you know, overall it still works, but you still have to deal with this annoying Rockstar launcher if you want to get this working. And then we've come to the point where, you know, it's kind of the reason why we're here today with Games for Windows Live, and that's Halo 2. And this is probably the easiest game in the entire collection to explain in terms of, you know, why Games for Windows Live existed in the first place. And as you may know, Halo 2 is an OG Xbox game, which is very different from any game in my collection here, because it's the only one that's not an Xbox 360 game. So they actually brought Halo 2 to Windows Vista, and they released that in 2007, which is obviously after the OG Xbox. You know, they were still making games for OG Xbox, but obviously the 360 came out in 2005, and at that point the OG Xbox became previous gen. But Halo 2 was kind of like a launch title for Games for Windows Live, and they were kind of trying to push this where, rather than just the games for Windows, which was just PC branding for Microsoft, this was bringing over the gamer tag, friends list, and achievement system, and kind of had that across, you know, 360 and the PC. And this was really unique at the time, obviously, you know, because they were trying something new, and they used Halo 2 as that kind of example and trying to launch that. But as we know, other than that, you know, it's kind of crazy to think back on something like this, that Halo is such a flagship series for Xbox, and then, you know, how successful it was on OG Xbox and the 360. But there was that attempt to showcase Halo 2 on PC and on Games for Windows Live, and, you know, we see that today, that Xbox is now trying to do the same. You know, they're bringing OG Xbox games to PC and giving them achievements. So to think that 20 years earlier they were trying to do this exact thing, it's kind of fascinating to kind of go back in history and look at something like this, because I think this is actually one aspect of Xbox and Games from Windows Live that people actually didn't know, is that they were trying this exact thing 20 years ago, and it may not have worked then, but I think people are remaining positive. I know I am, that bringing OG Xbox games and 360 games to PC is gonna work like this, but it's gonna be in a better environment, and it's gonna work a lot better than this particular thing did for people back then. And then from all of that excitement, we have to bring it down several levels here for Hour of Victory. So this is probably one of the more obscure games in the collection, and that's exactly why I like collecting for these games. This was an early first-person shooter by Midway, and it came out on the 360 in 2007, and then Games from Windows Live PC version came out a year later in 2008. So this is what you would maybe consider like a generic World War II shooter, but you could still play as like 3 different characters, each with different specialties. So again, every game around this time tried to be the next Call of Duty or try to do something similar to Call of Duty. This game even had multiplayer, but it still goes down in history as probably one of the worst first-person shooters. I mean, I have played this game. I haven't played it on Games from Windows Live yet because it requires some multiplayer stuff as well, which requires a lot of people to accomplish, but it's quick enough to get through for the full 1,000. And again, you could do it twice if you're crazy, if you want to experience like a very low level shooter on the 360 and PC, then obviously this is the game for you. But again, it was relatively painless to get through, but if you want to get 2,000 gamer score, at least you can do that. But surprisingly, this is one of the games that I had a hard time finding. Actually, I had to get someone from Europe to ship me a copy of this, and it was even missing the actual product key in there, so I had to use another game to activate this game. So it's one of those weird ones. It's, like I said, more obscure, but 360, it's easy to find this one. Games from Windows Live, it's become a little bit harder, but I still think it's worth having in the collection because it is kind of a weird one. Well, I guess we're not done with the weird games. I guess it's going to be the weird section of the video where I talk about a lot of the early weird games. But of course, we have to talk about Kane and Lynch Dead Men. This is a game by IO Interactive, of course, the people behind the Hitman games, and came out on Xbox 360 and Games from Windows Live in 2007. So, like I said, pretty early title in this whole ecosystem they were trying to create. But I think more so than the actual game, where you can play this solo, this is a third-person shooter, or you can play it local co-op, which is also an interesting aspect of this. Like if you wanted to get the full completion, you have to play it locally, whether you do it with a second controller or have someone in your household or a friend come over to help you with Kane and Lynch in multiplayer, or at least in co-op, then we obviously have that option as well. But this game has throughout time been more known for the controversial multiplayer called Fragile Alliance, and it's relatively fun if you play it and you have to work together, or you also have the option to betray each other. So if you work together and suddenly you're like, I'm going to take all the money for myself and I'm going to kill everyone else and escape, you absolutely can do that. But besides that, what kind of made this game throughout time, at least on Xbox, I don't know how it is on PlayStation, but at least throughout time on Xbox, this has become more notorious and infamous for the leaderboard achievements. There's a couple of them where you have to be number 1 and number 2. They don't give you any score. They're both two big goose eggs, but that's kind of what people are fighting for, is to be number 1 and 2 on the leaderboards. And that, of course, over time has become increasingly more difficult, and in some ways impossible if you don't know how to do it, or if you don't know how to get to the top, then that's very difficult, of course. It's one of those unusual games that just goes down, in Xbox history, that you have throughout both the 360 and Games from Windows Live. You have separate stacks and separate, ways of accomplishing that completion. And thankfully, the Games from Windows Live version does not have the DLC that the 360 has. But even if you wanted to grab that on the 360 still, I believe it's free, so you should still be able to grab that from the 360. But like I said, thankfully, Games from Windows Live version is only the 1,000 gamer score. So another notorious game that is fun to talk about. And yeah, if you ever think about, playing Kane and Lynch, just know that it might be difficult to 100% complete this game. And then moving on swiftly from the Fragile Alliance, we have Lost Planet Extreme Condition Colonies Edition. This was kind of like a remaster of the original Lost Planet from late 2006, early 2007. So that was an early Xbox 360 exclusive, and then they did this Colonies Edition, which added more maps and upgraded a lot of things. And obviously we can't forget that it also launched on Games with Windows Live in 2008. And funny enough, I actually recently played this game, you know, both the Lost Planet, the original one, and then the Colonies Edition, just trying to get multiplayer stuff done so I can just focus on the single player campaign after that. One of the interesting things here, yet again, this is another crossplay game, just like BlazBlue was. And so you could play against Xbox 360 players or Games with Windows Live players, whichever console platform you were on. So this was another one that offered that crossplay function. And, you know, that also in turn means that the achievement list is exactly the same. So there's no stack for this game. They share the achievement list across PC and console. This was just more built around trying to get that multiplayer experience going for multiple different platforms. And, you know, again, I think people enjoyed playing Lost Planet back in the day, multiplayer. I mean, I didn't really jump on that wagon so early on for the 360, so I didn't really have much experience with it, naturally, because I just told you that I just did the multiplayer in this game. But again, yeah, Lost Planet is just essentially third-person shooter, survival elements, and yeah, one of those early titles from Capcom that you just have to experience, you know, like I'm finally getting into the Lost Planet series now, and so from what I've done in multiplayer, obviously it is what is expected of that, but you know, I'm looking forward to playing the single player campaigns in these games. And we might as well talk about the next one as well, and that is Lost Planet 2. And this one came out in 2010, and again, another Capcom release, of course. And this is one that, you know, again, had a separate 360 release and a Games with Windows Live release. This one focused a lot more on co-op multiplayer. It still had online multiplayer as well. I do think this one has like one of those leaderboard achievements as well as part of like that whole grind. So I'm not sure what that looks like, but Lost Planet 2 is one of those, you know, again, like the first one, people seem to like them, but maybe they weren't as critically acclaimed as you would expect. But this was during the time where they were trying different things, and Lost Planet sort of got, yeah, again, no pun intended, it kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit, and we naturally got Lost Planet 3 as well. But Lost Planet 2 was at least the last one that got that Games with Windows Live and the 360 combo there. So, you know, whether I decide to play it on both remains to be seen, but, you know, I'm still glad I have both of them. And then we have Operation Flashpoint Red River, which is the second game, I believe, in the Operation Flashpoint series. It was like Dragon Rising, I think, came out before this. Did not get a Games with Windows Live release, though. It may have actually come out on Games with Windows, but this was developed and published by Codemasters. And this came out in 2011, so it was around that time where it probably was the peak of the 360, 2010, 2011. There were a lot of really good games around that time. And this is actually a game that sort of flew under the radar for the most part, and you don't hear a whole lot about this game, but I was actually pleasantly surprised that I liked this game a lot more than I expected. So it's obviously a first-person shooter, but it's not a very fast-paced one. It's nothing like Call of Duty, of course. You know, this is more about tactical movement and positioning and then ordering your squad around. So you're not supposed to run into a battlefield and start shooting, because you might have a sniper miles away that will kill you in one shot, and then you have to start over. So it's trying to be a lot more realistic. Sort of think of, I guess, Brothers in Arms meets some Rainbow Six, right? You know, but it's just a little bit more serious than that, I guess. And it's one of those games where I was, yeah, surprised to like it as much as I did, and I will most likely play it on the 360 as well. I actually played it on Games with Windows Live first, because I was trying to get some viral achievements. I think there's a couple of them that are required, and I do also think that this game is backwards compatible, so I'll probably play that on the Series X or Xbox One. But this game did have DLC though, and there's naturally not going to be any sort of Game of the Year for this one, so the DLC on Games with Windows Live is going to be difficult to get a hold of these days, obviously, unless you bought it before the store or the marketplace shut down. But you can still get it on the 360 through backwards compatibility. That one, oddly enough, was delisted at some point on the 360, and they made the game backwards compatible, and then suddenly you could buy the DLC again, which, you know, obviously I snagged that as soon as I found out that you could actually actually still buy the DLC for that one. But otherwise, yeah, this is a separate achievement list. It's the exact same thing. But I would recommend that you try this game out. You know, I'm so intrigued by this that I probably will go back and play Dragon Rising, and I'm hoping I'll like that as well. And you can actually play this game in co-op as well. I believe it's up to 4 people. So, you know, could be even more fun in co-op. I played it by myself, but I'm probably going to try to find some people to play with when I play it again. And then we have a lot of people's favorite open world game. We have Red Faction Guerrilla, and this was developed by Volition, which I quite enjoy Volition's games. And the game came out in 2009. It was considered one of the more impressive technical ideas of the 360 and PS3 generation. So essentially, everything was destructible in this game. I even remember destroying several bridges I needed for achievements later on in the game, and that kind of annoyed me to no end because I couldn't actually drive over the bridge. It's not like it respawned. Once you destroyed that bridge, it was gone for the rest of the game. So if you had like a race you had to do later on in your end game, you were kind of screwed. So they really made it very, very annoying to 100% complete this game. But it's okay. I still think it's a good game, and it's a good campaign, and the DLC is good as well. And of course, they remastered this game too on the Xbox One, so you can play it there with the DLC. But thankfully, the version on Games When It Was Live did not include the DLC. So if you never bought the DLC, you don't have to worry about that if you want to get the 100% completion. But the 360 obviously got that. And if you didn't snap up the DLC before they closed down the store, obviously you won't be able to get that. There was no like Game of the Year for this one. But there was like an awkward process to activate this game because you can still do it through Steam, but you have to kind of do some sort of Games for Windows Live legacy version through Steam. And I'm not quite sure if that works anymore, but I was able to activate it at least with my license key that I had from the game, and then put that into Steam, and then it installed the game for me. This game has also a lot of multiplayer to get through, and this is one heck of a completion in my opinion, and one that you're going to be working on for a while. And chances are I probably will play this on Games for Windows Live as well. I just don't know when. And funny enough, we have another game from 2009, and that's Resident Evil 5, my very first Resident Evil game. And oddly enough, when I talk to people, you know, I don't know if it's a generational thing or what it is, but a lot of people that I've talked to, like, Resident Evil 5 was their first Resident Evil game as well, which, you know, probably pisses off like old school Resident Evil people, because how on earth could you start with Resident Evil 5, you know? But goes to show that people actually appreciate this and have appreciated this game a lot more in recent years, which, you know, I think is cool. I don't think it's the best game in the world, but I had a good time with this one, especially in co-op yet again. And it goes without saying that this was another Capcom developed and published game. You know, it came out in 2009, like I said, and then the PC version, Games When It Was Live, came out later that year. And one of the selling points really for this game was the co-op, and whether you played as Chris or Sheva, you know, it's kind of an interesting conversation too with Sheva. A lot of people feel like she is not a good AI companion, but you know, you could find a friend to play through this game. You could also do that through Games When It Was Live as well, through Xbox Live, so you could play online co-op. And you know, it's the same, pretty much the same achievement list in this game too, minus the DLC. So the PC version does not have the DLC, and of course the Xbox 360 version has the 1400 gamer score, but the PC one just had the 1000. So, you know, it's slightly easier, I would say, but still, you got to go through all the speed runs and go through the harder difficulties and stuff like that. So it's still a good time though. Like, I recently played this, I think earlier this year or last year, and I finished the campaign, and I still enjoy this game, and I probably will do this on Xbox One as well. You know, once I finish up this one, then I'll move on to the next one, and you can play it twice here, you know, 2 different achievement lists and more gamer score for a pretty good game, I would say. So for this next one, I'll try to be a little bit more gentle this time. I have kind of bashed this game for as long as I can remember making videos. So this is Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. This was one of the later Games When It Was Live titles that came out in 2012. And as I'd mentioned previously, this was published by Capcom, but this was developed by Slant 6 Games, which I think they made like the SOCOM games, maybe? Like I would have to double check that, but it sounds like they were more tactical third-person shooter type of developer. So yeah, they were given the reins on Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. And as I mentioned, this was a later title for Games When It Was Live. So a lot of times when you are trying to activate your Games When It Was Live client and try to get the most up-to-date one, this is sort of one of the games that they recommend using to get the latest and greatest, at least. And that's exactly what I did as well. You know, before they started changing some things in Windows and stuff broke, then usually Operation Raccoon City's install client, at least that was the one that did the trick. So, you know, if you have issues with that, then maybe try this game. Unfortunately though, you're gonna have to get a new copy of this game because it is a one-time code again. You know, that's when they were trying to do around this time, you know, the DRM and the one-time codes and contacting servers and stuff. So it wasn't a great system, obviously. I quite like having the legacy key situations. I can use it on multiple accounts or multiple computers and stuff like that, and it wasn't like stuck to my account specifically. But you know, that's kind of how things have gone with licensing, you know, over the years. It's just kind of try to attach everything to your account, and if you lose your account, you're kind of screwed. But here it's a slightly different type of game. You play as members of the Umbrella Security Service. You don't play as like Leon or Chris or Jill or anything like this. So it is up to, I believe, 4-player co-op in this one. I played this one in 2-player co-op, and I didn't have the best of times, but I'm gonna try to remain positive here. There is multiplayer in this game that I did both on 360 and on PC, but it's one of those things that once you kind of get through it, you know, then you just kind of try to get through the rest of it. And for me at least, you know, I can't wait to be done with this game. I still need to go back and complete both of them. And on the 360, you know, it had some DLC, which I actually thought the DLC was fine. It didn't overstay its welcome really, so you get an extra 500 gamer score for the DLC, and this game is also backwards compatible. But the Games of Windows Live version only had the 1000G. It did not have the DLC, so that was never included in that version of the game. So, you know, when it comes to doing the full completion on this game, it's definitely a bit of a grind, and it's not always the most fun you'll have with any Resident Evil game. But you know, this game exists, and that's how I'm going to end this section for Operation Raccoon City. So we've already talked about Halo 2 so far, but here is another one that was equally as important for Games of Windows Live as Halo 2, and that was Shadowrun. And I actually didn't realize how important this game was or how early this game came out. So this is actually a game from 2007, and it sort of acted like a launch title again for Games of Windows Live, because this one was the first game that introduced the cross-platform gameplay, or at least multiplayer, between Windows and 360. Because majority of this game, minus maybe the tutorial levels and some of the training stuff, it is primarily a multiplayer game. And it's, again, one of those big battlegrounds, or a lot of players can play at once. I would say it's probably between 12 to 16. I think it's probably average. You probably have some smaller maps. And this was kind of like the selling point for Windows Vista was Shadowrun and Halo 2, although Vista was obviously a terrible OS before Windows 7 came out. But still, you know, they tried, and I actually recently started Shadowrun, and you know, it's an interesting early game for sure. You know, that's all I can say so far. I haven't gotten too much into it. I've been trying to dabble in this whole Windows Vista, or like obviously I have Windows 10 or Windows 11 now, but trying to get that working with my 360 and see what that looks like, hosting games online. And I can imagine back in the day, this was pretty cool to be on a laptop or a computer and like hosting a game, and your friends would join on the 360. You know, so again, it's one of those early ones that set the standard for Games of Windows Live and designed to be purely like a multiplayer experience. You know, it's a first-person shooter with all sorts of kind of weird skills, and just like the other crossplay games that I've talked about, this shared the exact same achievement list. So whether you played it on Windows Vista or on the 360, that's the same achievement list. So yeah, you didn't get any extra gamer score for this one. So something I guess you had to contend with if you wanted to have that cool cross-platform gameplay. And here's probably one of the more niche and lesser known Star Wars games. And this is Star Wars The Clone Wars Republic Heroes. This was developed by Chrome Studios and published by LucasArts, and it came out in 2009. So supposedly right in the middle of the Clone Wars television series. So I guess this is based on that. And you know, this is probably not going to be one of the more standout Star Wars games ever made, especially considering you had like Force Unleashed, the 2 Force Unleashed games on the 360. You know, they were pretty decent games, I would say. So this one sort of was more in the shadows of those games, and probably not a lot of people have played this one or know about this one. But one thing it had for it is that it was like a local 2-player co-op game, so that is probably fun. I'm looking forward to at least trying that out. I don't think it's required for the achievements, but it probably makes things easier and more fun. But when it comes to the actual achievements, so yeah, the Games of Windows Live version has a separate achievement list. But if you're looking for like a local local co-op game at least, you know, whether you play it on PC or you play it on Games Windows Live, you know, this is probably going to be a decent time. And I think I got both copies around the same time. So yeah, it was definitely a game that kind of went off my radar for a while, and then yeah, just had to add it to the collection on both sides. And then we have more of the unique and obscure games, I guess. And here's a game called Stormrise. And this is by Creative Assembly. So shout out Alien Isolation. This is such a weird developer to me because they mostly make RTS games. And they're mostly known for the Total War games, which, you know, again, since this is like a PC episode, you know, I played a ton of Rome Total War back in the day. And I really like those types of games on PC. Creative Assembly has also worked on some of the Halo games, I think, Halo Wars, and so they've had a hand in a lot of different projects, especially those strategy games, but you know, Alien Isolation is the one that kind of stands out in that whole mix. But other than that, you know, this was another game that came out in 2009, so 2009 was a very busy year for Games Windows Live, I guess, and this also got a separate achievement list as well, the same exact one, but you could play it on 360 and get a set of achievements there, and then you could also play it on Games Windows Live, completely separate, of course. And as I mentioned here, this is like a real-time strategy game as well, and I would most likely be more comfortable playing this with a mouse and a keyboard. I don't know, I recently actually started like Halo Wars, and once I moved away from PC, I stopped playing strategy games, and maybe now's the time. I know very little about Stormrise, but you know, if it's Creative Assembly, they typically make pretty good games, from what I've seen at least. Then we get to a series that kind of defined that early PC gaming for me as well, although a lot of people play this on console and in the arcades, but I played this on PC first and foremost, and that was Street Fighter 4. Not Street Fighter 4, of course, it was more like Street Fighter 1 and 2. This one's kind of important in this setting here because in around this time, fighting games were not as popular anymore. You know, we know the arcades sort of died out a little bit too, and I know there's still been a comeback with arcades and stuff like that too, and tons of people still go to arcades, especially over in Japan. Street Fighter was kind of credited as bringing fighting games back to the mainstream spotlight again, because back in the 90s, I feel like all there was, 90s, early 2000s was just fighting games everywhere. And so, yeah, naturally, that's how I got started with fighting games too. I don't play them as much as I used to, but at least, you know, in 2008 when this game came out, the fighting games kind of got a second wind again, and people started loving Street Fighter again, which obviously Street Fighter is one of my favorites as well. So again, another Capcom, lots of Capcom support for Games Windows Live here apparently. Not just Street Fighter 4, but you'll see the next couple here as well. It's kind of an interesting mix of these fighting games. But in terms of achievements for these, like the 360 had a completely different stack for this. Same achievement list though, so there was no difference. As we know with these fighting games, no matter what game, it seems like they are incredibly grindy achievement wise. So if you're obviously playing competitively or you're playing for fun, that's probably going to be a little bit different than if you are an achievement hunter. Then you're just going to be grinding out specific things for hours and hours on end. But you know, that's kind of how it goes. Unfortunately, they're designed to be played over and over again. You're meant to go online and play against random people. You're meant to play locally with friends and family, right? Like that's what these games are built around. And you know, I still have a good time with these fighting games, especially Street Fighter, but I'm so behind on these games that I still add them to my collection in hopes that I'll find my way back there again, because generally speaking, like my PC days were fighting games, point and click games, and then strategy games. So it's definitely changed once I moved to console, but this is a fantastic one to have on both platforms. And yeah, I probably will give Street Fighter 4 a chance on PC here soon. And here's one of the more interesting releases on Games Windows Live. This is Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition. This one gets a little bit complicated because the 360 version and the PC version, they were kind of released differently around 2010, 2011. And on the 360, you had Super Street Fighter, which was the main game, and then Arcade Edition was released as separate DLC for like 160 gamer score, whatever it was. And it added like 8 achievements for that. And then it received another DLC expansion expansion for that called Ultra Street Fighter 4, and then that got another 200 gamer score, so that equaled 1,360 in the end. So when the Games for Windows Live version of Super Street Fighter 4 came out, they only included the arcade edition as part of the DLC, but instead of releasing it separately, they incorporated it into the main game. So that's why the achievement total there, or the gamer score, is 1160, so because it doesn't have that Ultra Street Fighter DLC. At first glance, I thought that this was maybe just the DLC, but it is actually the main game plus that one DLC, which gave me even more reason to collect for something like this, because it's so unusual and kind of unique to have something like this in a collection where it sort of feels like it's an incomplete Ultimate Edition in some ways, where they just excluded some DLC. I own the DLC separately on 360, and I do believe it's backwards compatible as well. So that's kind of the easiest way to explain the difference between the two, because it is, like I said, a pretty cool one to have, and ultimately it's going to be the same game minus that one DLC. And of course, we're not done with Street Fighter, because we can just do Street Fighter all day long here. And we have Street Fighter Cross Tekken. And if people say Street Fighter X Tekken, that just is a clear indicator that they've never played this game, because even if you load this game up to the main menu, you will know perfectly clear that it's Street Fighter Cross Tekken, because it is a crossover with Tekken. But anyway, that's just what I wanted to start with, I guess. This was developed by Capcom, and then they published it as well in 2012. So again, this was similar to Raccoon City, a later Games for Windows Live title. So naturally, that also meant that this was like a one-time code. It was just kind of starting to take over. There weren't as many games as part of the service anymore, but they definitely pushed that whole DRM and the one-time code kind of thing. This game wasn't as aggressive as some of the other ones around that time, but you still needed a brand new copy to be able to activate the game and play online. So again, like I said, this is just a crossover. I actually really enjoyed this one. I know a lot of hardcore Tekken fans didn't like this because it kind of used more of the fighting style from Street Fighter rather than Tekken. So individually, I love both series, but I still think they did a great job with this game. And, you know, I've done all the multiplayer in this game so far, and I've started kind of doing the story mode or like the campaign in some ways. So knowing that this is going to be more or less like Street Fighter rather than Tekken, then, you know, go into it with those expectations at least. But the good news is that it has separate achievement stacks for this too, so you can get it on the 360, and you can also play it again on Games for Windows Live and get that same achievement list, you know, the same 1,000 gamer score. I think this is well worth playing, and I really enjoyed Street Fighter Cross Tekken. And here is one of the peskier ones, I would say, for Games for Windows Live, and this is Tron Evolution. So this game actually came out alongside Tron Legacy in 2010, and it sort of serves as a prequel to that movie. This was made by Propaganda Games, and it was published by Disney, which is why this one is a little bit of a pain. So it kind of is like an action adventure in a place sort of like Assassin's Creed at times, and it's like fast moving combat, and you have this disc that you throw around. So I mean, I'm not too familiar with the Tron movies, but you know, from what I played of this game, I mean, it's pretty good. I wouldn't say it's like a 10 out of 10, but it's probably in the mid-range most likely. But again, they had a stack on Games for Windows Live, and this is definitely one game that you're going to struggle a little bit with activating, because I had something called Secure ROM, and you also had the Disney BS on top of that too. So it's not impossible to obviously play this game on Games for Windows Live, but chances are it's going to be a little bit tricky, because you also need to have a brand new copy. This is one of those games that need that one-time code or the product key that you can only use one time, and then you also have to deal with this online activation and the Disney stuff and then whatever else. So this one is a little bit more complicated, but even these days, if you can find a new copy for this, I'm sure it's not cheap, but it's definitely a strange one. But I think the game is pretty decent though overall. It is a separate achievement stack, like I said, and you get 1,000 gamer score separately. So if you are willing to go through all those hoops, then you know, that would be awesome. But just don't mess with Disney is all I have to say. And then we have another game that I would probably put more in the niche, kind of obscure category, and that's Universe at War Earth Assault. And if it wasn't for Games for Windows Live, I probably would never pick up this game, but this is a game that's published by Sega, and it is also another cross-platform game. And this is again a real-time strategy game similar to Stormrise that we already talked about, and this had that cross-platform play that it offered, so you could play against people on 360 360 if you were on PC, and vice versa, of course. And they were most likely just trying to incorporate different genres for that cross-platform, because we've already talked about Lost Planet, and we also had Shadowrun, so this was just another type of game to play with the different platforms or play with other players on the opposite platform. And you know, one kind of interesting thing to note about this, there's actually one achievement that at least I could gather that unless you have a PC copy of this game, you might not be able to unlock it, because I think it's more catered to unlocking it on PC, but I haven't confirmed that because I haven't played this game. But it's at least like a partially discontinued achievement that you have a better success rate unlocking it on PC. This is a shared achievement list between the Xbox 360 and Games of Windows Live, so there's no separate stack for this one. So whether you decide to play it on PC or play it on 360, just keep an eye out for that one achievement at least, because that's seemingly the one that is better to unlock on PC. And then we're down to the last two, and why wouldn't we sort of end this video with a sports game, or at least the only Olympic game, and this is Vancouver 2010. And I bought this on the 360 first, and you know, again, this is going to be around the year 2010 that this came out. Officially licensed Olympic sports game, and Vancouver 2010 is the only Olympic game that came out, as far as I know, at least physically, on Games of Windows Live. So that was kind of an interesting strategy for this. But like I said, they were trying to have variety in the games and the genres. So this was all about the 2010 Olympics. You had some multiplayer stuff in here too that you could do. There was a separate achievement list for this on the 360 and the Games of Windows Live. So if you wanted to do this game twice, I mean, you absolutely could. I haven't played a lot of these Olympic games on the 360. I played a ton of them on PC actually, which is kind of ironic that we're talking about this Vancouver 2010. And I used to play a lot of ski jumping games and downhill skiing and all sorts of Olympic games in the past. Mostly, I would say winter sports, not so much the summer ones, but it's kind of the track and field days, I guess, if you go all the way back there too. But I know Vancouver at the time, you know, it transformed the whole city when they had the Olympic Games up there and stuff. So it's a game that I probably will play at some point, but that's kind of fascinating that this is the only Olympic game that I'm aware of, at least on Games of Windows Live. And finally, another exclusive for Xbox here, and we of course end this with Viva Pinata. And this was developed by Rare and, like I said, published by Microsoft, and with the 360 version actually coming out in 2006, which I actually covered in a different video on our main channel. And then the Games of Windows Live PC version came out in 2007. And this, to me, is kind of the type of game that would be better played maybe on PC. I'm not quite sure. I have played a good amount of the Viva Pinata games on the 360, and I'm kind of indifferent about them. I think they're pretty fun, but like, I don't know how much time I really want to invest in them. But you know, I can understand the appeal. I understand why people like this early 360 game, and you know, they obviously made it more user-friendly on a controller, and you know, this seems like the kind of game that might be a little bit easier with a mouse or like a keyboard. I'm not quite sure. It's not quite a strategy game. It's more like a garden simulator where you attract pinatas, you try to mate the pinatas, their friends, their enemies. You're trying to obviously build this garden, and you know, again, it's one of those early Rare games that had a lot more complicated system than I think people give them credit for. But it was a fun game at the time, and it also got a separate achievement list, so that's pretty exciting. So you have the 1000G that you can get in either one, either on the 360 or on PC. This isn't the last we saw of Viva Pinata, but it was the only Viva Pinata that came out through Games of Windows Live. Thank you for watching today. I do appreciate it, and I know that was a lot of talking, that was a lot of PC, a lot of 360, but this is the kind of stuff that I love talking about. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and my voice is cracking, but hopefully you enjoyed it, and you know, I will be making more videos. So I'll see you then. Take care.